Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this, our fourth webinar in our series of our Future Farm Resilience Programme, which we're delivering on behalf of Defra. So my name is Greg Beeton, and I lead the programme for Brown&Co. Just before we get into the detail of the session, just a few housekeeping points. We are recording this, and we generally find we get a lot of people watching it as a recording, and we'll send the link to everybody participating and others afterwards. We're going to run for about 55 minutes. I'm very conscious there is a TFA webinar that starts at 7 o'clock, and we will be done in time for that. We will encourage as many questions as we can, and at the bottom of people's screen there is a Q&A button, and please do that to post questions. They will come through to us and the panelists, and I will ask as many of those as we can. Anything that we can't answer due to time, we'll follow up with afterwards. So this evening we are focusing on tenancy matters, and we have a very experienced panel with us tonight, and I'd like to just introduce the panel members. So we're very grateful that Baroness Kate Rock is here. Thank you, Kate. And Kate is going to talk through the highlights of the ROC review. So thank you, Kate. We're also joined by a team of land agents. So Joanna Merritt is joining us from Robert H. Hicks in Devon. And then we have from Brown&Co, Jamie Seaman and Ellie Allwood, both land agents, and as Joanna, RICS registered valuers. And we're also joined by our managing partner, Charles Whittaker.
Good evening.
Thank you. So we're going to have just a quick run through for those who haven't joined us before, what the project's about and what we've talked about in our previous webinars. And then we're going to focus for most of the time on a discussion. And we do want to make it a discussion of some of the sort of issues, challenges, but also opportunities facing tenants. The Future Farm Resilience Fund for Defra, this is the scale-up phase. We've been involved in both the pilot and the interim phases. And this phase now runs pretty much from last month all the way through to March 25. So plenty of opportunity for free support and advice during that period for farmers across the whole of England. So just a quick bit on Brown&Co for those of you who don't know us. So we are a business, and where I think we have a real strength is our mix of professionals. So as well as agribusiness professionals, we are a land agency company, we have planners, and we also have environmentalists. And so we can offer advice pretty much to most of the support requirements for farmers, and we're particularly strong with tenant farmers. We're also working with Robert H. Hicks down in Southwest, and the little green arrow there is where Joanna is sitting now, I believe. So quickly, just why sign up for this project? Well, I really believe, and I've been involved with the project for the last 2 years, that this is a real opportunity for some free advice and support to really help farmers, and tenant farmers in particular, navigate through some of the changes we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of uncertainty out there, whether it's driven by policy, whether it's driven by external shocks. We've got ongoing personal succession and sort of family matters to work through. And then we've got the weather. And whilst these challenge all farmers, I think some of these particularly challenge tenant farmers. So things like elms, things like diversification, not so straightforward for tenants. So we're going to talk through some of those today. Next slide, please. So just a quick little bit on what we've learned and who we've worked with so far. So in our last phase of the project, the interim, we worked with 750 farmers across all of England. A significant proportion of those were tenants or had tenanted land. A significant portion also were livestock farmers. So all farms, all types across all of England. And what did we find from that project? And this, I think, is key for the opportunity of support going forward. So we found that 86% of farmers, this was from our survey results, know they need to make some changes. Probably not surprising. And I think the project can help that significant percentage de-risk and work through, not necessarily knowing what they need to, knowing that they need to make change, but what they need to do and thinking about how that can be planned. We also found that very few or relatively few are taking action at the moment. we found that probably, a high proportion are thinking about succession, a high proportion have opportunities in land and buildings, a high proportion want to take environmental schemes up. So we've designed this main phase of our project to pick up all of those. So we've got 7 interventions that you can see on the right there around planning, around land, around natural capital, around supporting tenants, around technology, and around the environment. So these are offering choices for farmers going forward. And I just want to quickly run through those next. And these have all been covered, or some of these have been covered in our webinars so far, and we'll put the links for those in the chat. So those of you who haven't seen the links already, do have a look at them. So we're offering an overall business review, which really gives a snapshot and oversight of the business today. And I think as things have changed so much in the last couple of years, how a business looks today might be very different to how it was a couple of years ago. We're also offering the next intervention, looking at detail of budgeting and planning, thinking about the numbers, not looking back at accounts, looking at this year, next year, and how farmers can really plan finances. Really important with increasing input costs, and particularly with the cost of money as well. Big change coming there. The next intervention is looking at technology and collaboration and how farmers can work more effectively together, bringing in here as well support with accessing grant schemes. We saw the new slurry scheme launched today from Defra. Those farmers who are in the right geographic area could be something to look at. Short deadline though, end of January, I believe. So our next intervention is looking at land and property, and this is where we bring in our planners. And our last webinar in this series in 2 weeks' time is looking at planning for buildings, planning for land. We're also going to be talking about renewable energies there as well, and how they might be part of a mix on farm to drive down costs. The next of our interventions is around natural capital, and here again we're going into some detail. We're looking at habitats and thinking about how habitats assessment might inform packaging land for biodiversity net gain. We're looking at woodland, and then we're particularly looking at agro-environmental schemes, and we've got an optimizer that can look at the best mix or an optimum mix on farm between stewardship, sustainable farming incentive as it grows, as the new options come in, and we'll bring in elms to that as it becomes real towards the end of the project. The 5th intervention is greenhouse gas footprinting, and this is one that we believe a good baseline in greenhouse gas footprinting will indicate those areas for greenhouse gas reduction that also generally support reductions in costs on farm as well and more efficiency. So they go hand in hand. We're going to bring in thinking about carbon into that as well. And our last one is around tenant support. Now, just before we move into tenant support, what I will say is that all of the previous interventions are open to tenant farmers. So tenants can choose whatever they like from the mix to work with us on. But we also have one that we're offering as well that's really looking at tenancy matters. And we've got a list here that we've pulled together that we think are important. So what we want to do now is, before we move into a discussion around some of these tenancy matters, is if I could bring in Baroness Kate Rock and ask Kate just to run through the Rock report, and we'll then build on that when we move into the discussion.
Greg, thank you. And it's a real privilege to be part of the Brown&Co webinar this evening. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm not going to take up much time on the sort of the detail of the Rock review. There are 74 recommendations for Defra. There are what I would call the quick wins, which are around the scheme design, and then there's sort of some longer term recommendations around what I would consider to be around sort of tenancy reform and support that we can ensure that we do have, as the title says, a vibrant and thriving agricultural tenancy sector for the long term. But I thought I'd just give a quick overview. As we know, the ownership and management and use of land in England underpins our complete rural economy, food security, and the state of the environment. And 64% of farmable land in England is wholly or partly managed by tenant farmers. So it's absolutely critical to make sure that tenant farmers are able to contribute to improving our environment, levelling up the rural economy, and providing and doing food production, which are all flagship ambitions that this government has set. That was the basis of the understanding that led to the Rock Review. It was commissioned by the previous Secretary of State for Defra, George Eustace, at the beginning of this year, and I spent the last 9 months travelling around England talking to tenant farmers. I expect and I hope on this webinar that I probably did speak to some, and I'm very grateful to everybody who provided submissions and sat around round tables. And it's been very clear that we've brought together all the issues and challenges. And amongst those issues and challenges, there were two that really stood out as particularly problematic and really may prevent tenant farmers from playing their part in the future of farming. Now, the first is short-term tenancies. These have remained really on average over the past 20 years, less than 4 years, which is truly not right if we're looking at sort of long-term viability for businesses. And the second is the restrictive clauses in tenants' agreements with landlords. Now, taken those together, this may prevent tenant farmers from even entering the new schemes or taking actions that government wants to see. The Rock Review says that government won't be able to meet its targets by using the proportion of land that is owner occupied. And therefore, a considerable opportunity for the government is to use tenant farmers as a real litmus test of scheme design. In my view, if the majority of schemes work within the constraints facing tenant farmers, then they can work for other land management structures. So government does need to recognise the importance of and the potential that tenant farmers have to accelerate our progress towards improving our environment and providing nutritious, secure and high quality food. As I said, we brought together views from all stakeholders in the land use sector, and the recommendations to Defra are made on the ELM schemes in the short term. They've all been tested with Defra. We were very clear that we wanted to work with Defra to ensure that we weren't putting recommendations that weren't achievable. We also worked very closely with the RPA to make sure that all of that could be implemented. So they are very, hopefully very easy wins that will ensure that the schemes are open, accessible and flexible for all. And then we also, as I said, looked at the longer term in terms of the future of farming in the tenanted sector. I'm now working with government to ensure that the feet are held to the fire and the recommendations are being looked at. I am assured by Defra that they are that they're looking at them and they will approaching their response with the same sense of urgency that I committed to doing the review. I don't think I need to go into detail, Greg, on the recommendations. They are there on the website if anybody wants to put a link onto it, but happy to take questions on that. But I think in the interest of time, I think I'll leave that there.
Thank you, Kate. And I just noted down actually, and I remembered from a TFA webinar where you presented the full report to, that the big ticket items of recommendations were around accessing new schemes that you talked about, longer term tenancies, joint applications for productivity schemes with landowners, and then sort of incentives to catalyze infrastructure investment as well. And I think we'll pick up on some of those now in the I suppose the grounded bottom-up approach that we want to take a little bit more now in the Q&A. So does anybody else on the panel want to add anything to Kate's summary, or were you happy to move on to the next section? Yeah, okay, we'll build it into the next. So thank you very much, Kate. So the next slide really tries to pull together now 7 areas that we've picked up from our work with tenants, from discussions with others, that I think constitute areas of certainly of interest, particularly, and some of challenge, but some opportunity for tenants. And if those who are watching, if you want to put in any questions on the Q&A throughout the next half an hour or so on any of these areas, please put them in and we'll feed them in. And we hope that we might get more questions as we move through the sections. So if we could start with the first section, which is on land. And I think that some of the things that we're starting to see could be around different ways of, or different approaches when tendering for land. We've got the whole element of BPS reducing, and how is that, or how might that be affecting some of these tenders? And so can we kick off with what we're seeing? Jamie, would you like to, I know you have a couple of recent examples of what's happening in your patch.
Yep, sure. Good evening, everybody. Just drawing on some recent experience, we're asked to let some farms for this autumn by councils, and it's actually applying for all institutions and estates, where the tender process is becoming a lot more detailed. 10 years ago, it used to often just be a form where you'd put the rent you wanted to offer and maybe a financial reference, and that was about it. But now, particularly in the council's case, they want to look at a business's proposals, their cultivation techniques, their rotations, their environmental aims and desires, whether they're going to go into a stewardship scheme, succession. The age of the tenant is obviously very important now, and there seems to be a drive on younger entrants, which has obviously been discussed throughout policy in the recent years. So yeah, my initial comment would be that there's a lot more information required, a lot more thinking, and it's less about the number at the bottom. It's not just about the number at the bottom, it's equally about what the tenant is going to do and how they're going to do it.
Just on that point, Jamie, you mentioned a couple of county council tenders. Have we seen, I suppose everybody's view, but have we seen evidence of some councils reinvesting in farmland for all sorts of different objective reasons, and there are going to be more county council holdings available, do we think? Or I know we've seen some councils disinvesting in farmland. Is there a sort of theme that started to emerge since everything's changed so radically in 2022, or not really as yet? I
don't think so. I mean, it's obviously council specific, and Norfolk is the council that we're involved with, obviously, and they will invest in land in the right place in conjunction with existing holdings that they have. I don't think they're up for going and buying land in isolated locations where they're not already owners. So that's their policy, and so certainly buying new holdings is something that they perhaps consider, but I don't know whether they're investing as heavily in their existing holdings as tenants might like them to. I don't know, really. I don't want to speak out of turn, but yeah, it's too council specific to say, and there's no real trend either way.
Joe, did you have an example in the southwest? I think of
well, just commenting on the whole county council purchasing land. There are isolated occasions, but I think it's a case if they buy some, they're selling some somewhere else to roll it over within their estate. I don't think there's a matter of an investment going on, given the budget demands on councils. And in relation to sort of rents and tenancy scenarios, I have seen in the past institutional landlords being more interested in looking at mechanisms which work for tenants and the landlord for rent reviews, as opposed to now when you're serving notice 12 months in advance of a review. There's a lot of volatility in the industry. So to try to hedge that volatility, I've seen sort of almost a profit rent element being incorporated to look at actual profits being made on the farm and sharing those within the agreement, which enables a sort of a base rent and looking at industry and a reward from the tenants. So sort of there's an element of perhaps as agents we should go forward to encourage some of that type of thing, but it's obviously a case of you have to have a good relationship with your landlord to be able to sort of respect the need to have ongoing investment.
Ellie, do you have any examples of, or particularly maybe bringing in the BPS point? Are we seeing BPS having an impact at all on tenders and rents and expectation from landlords?
I personally haven't been dealt with many tenders, but in terms of rents and rent reviews, this year's been the most unusual year. This time last year, or 15 months ago, one would have definitely thought that BPS reduction would have been affecting rent. On the back of higher commodity prices, drier summer, etc., we haven't seen that impact, although clearly it must be in everybody's mind. But it's remarkable, even looking back over history, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds per tonne on wheat soon puts everything else into perspective. And it will be interesting next year, obviously, as if profits are squeezed, clearly basic payment adds to that, and it will have an impact. But this year we've seen less of it, and that's been noticeable both in FBT rents and in AHA rents. You know, we haven't seen that flurry of rent review notices setting a trend. That's not to say there's been no rent reviews, but we haven't seen the trend of, well, BPS is falling, therefore rents are going to be affected.
I think it's fairly fair to say that's true, and the thing you need to be as a tenant is mindful of is if you serve a rent notice now, let's say for next Lady Day in March, you'll review your rent in March 2024, which sees the end of BPS, but that will also mean that you'll then won't have a new rent review period until 3 years later, which BPS then potentially could end in 2027. So actually, when is the right time to jump is the important thing, which I think actually at the moment we're just seeing the loss in BPS being covered by the increase in commodity prices, really. So that's sort of marrying it up. So perhaps with energy prices kicking in, we're looking at bigger problems in 18 months to 2 years time to see.
Yes, I think to date, the gross margins, one has seen a profit, it's been matched, increased profitability, increased costs. What we haven't actually looked at, if you looked at strict budgets, we haven't really addressed recently fixed costs, but it is the energy costs, machinery costs, lack of labour costs, etc. And as much whereas before that always used to be, yes, we always had an argument about it, but they're pretty standard. We always focused on the commodity prices. Those fixed costs are going to be a bit of a killer going forward, and really makes people start to think.
And I think there's been a lot of farmers that perhaps have, in an arable world, had purchased their fertiliser forward, so may have even got this year's fertiliser by forward buying. So there will be some farmers from a livestock perspective who will say, well, I'm not buying it because the money's not there to do it. So their output is going to be significantly hit as well within the next 18 months as such. So that's going to have the sort of longer term implications to it, really. So we are probably going in a bit of a downward spiral, and anybody who's brave enough to spend in a livestock sector the money, I think dairy industry can spend the money on the fertiliser, but beef and sheep probably are looking at it in a very questionable way and looking at environmental schemes to be able to provide that alternative income.
Greg,
sorry, yeah.
No, I just wanted to add one thing that when Defra were modelling all of this out, there was a very clear thought within Defra, and it was in one of their early reports that rents were going to come down. I think they have been very surprised to see that rents have not been coming down. And when I went around the country, anecdotally, any rent review was asking for a significant rent increase, certainly with no understanding perhaps that with the impact of BPS. So I think it's a live concern.
No, I agree with that. Just to pop in there, Greg, I think I spent all my life doing farm budgets and forward projections, multi-year projections, and very much working on net margin rather than a gross margin basis, which I think is a sort of a need for that language change to take place, really, not just because of things that have happened since 24th of February, but even before that, with operating costs, labour costs, energy costs now being very, very significant and massive increase. I think net margin where everybody has to focus. But I think I would agree with that. I think 2022 in general for the arable sector, but not all the arable sector, comparable crops possibly, but certainly not root crops and salad crops, and certainly not the beef and sheep sector. 22 has been a good year, but for those other sectors it's not been so good. And looking at 23 and 24 forecasts with the significant increase in OPEX or operating costs, fuel, machinery, labour and energy, I think it's a very different picture. But I would agree. I think 22 commodities outside beef and sheep and pigs and poultry and one or two other sectors has largely been BPS attrition has been absorbed by commodity price increases, and which is why I think generally we've all been a bit reluctant to do anything about changing or putting our neck on the block for putting a rent notice in.
Yeah.
So what we're hearing at the moment then is little movement on rent reviews and little change driven by BPS at the moment. These things might change, but that seems to be the consensus right now. So just a couple of more points on land just to pick up on. Just thinking about Jamie's comment regarding younger entrants tendering. Certainly in my experience of assisting younger entrants, one of the biggest things that landlords or landlords agents looked at was the ability for new entrants to finance their plan going forward. And so the bigger the balance sheet, usually coming from family or somebody else supporting them, was often a key part of the tender. And I'm just wondering whether we're seeing that changing, or the potential for that change, and other areas becoming more important, because that's always been a challenge for the newer entrants. And Jamie, I don't know whether you've got a view on that, or Charles, or anyone. I can see Joe nodding a little bit. Well, Charles wants to say something, then maybe Joe, I don't know whether you're nodding or just agreeing with me.
But I mean, I generally find something to say about most things, but I would just say that it's using imagination for tenants. Anybody who wants to get into the industry, it's right. Okay, if I'm working as a herdsman, then I need to be able to work to be able to buy some cows, maybe to be able to milk them where I am, and having that as part of my reward. So I've actually building up my capital in a different way, saving it and putting what they can do with it, working in a share farming arrangement. I know the government seem to be encouraging more, or let's say promoting sort of share farming arrangements or working in partnership collaboration. And I think probably as an industry, we need to move forward in doing that type of thing to enable those with the capital, those farmers that might want to retire, to be able to say, look, you can use my factors of production as such, but you can provide the labour and enterprise.
I think,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, I was just going to say very quickly, it may be an example that the old problem of the tax tail wagging the farmer dog. If it took a simple example, the farmer wanting to retire, if he carried on farming using contract farmers, he can claim 100% agricultural property relief on his farmland, on his farmhouse. If he lets that land to somebody, he starts to lose that tax advantage on the farmhouse. If you're starting to look at more positive tax advantages to farmers to take on younger farmers, it would help an awful lot. And the only other examples I've seen is 2 or 3 years ago, I went to I was at an NFU tenants conference, and there was 2 or 3 young tenant farmers there who'd taken on licenses and really pushed themselves. My biggest concern was they had so little security. And I think they were immensely brave young people who had made themselves into businessmen with lack of security. But even then, they were getting to a certain age, maybe because they were trying to get married or have children or whatever, saying we need to have some security of tenure. And I think that's the biggest problem. There are opportunities there, but if they're not protected, all of a sudden it could all come crashing. And you see examples of people taking short-term tenancies, and the landlords could just bring it to an end or decide not to relet, and the tenant thinks it's going to be relet to them, and then it all comes crashing down. So we still do need to do quite a lot. There's people out there wanting to do it, but we still need to do a lot to support and protect them.
We made 6 recommendations to government on new entrants, including things like a loan facility, including considering how to de-risk arrangements where an existing tenant can take on a new entrance to ensure new tenants can get experience. We also made recommendations about pulling a tax lever for longer tenancy agreements to improve that 4 years. We want to have sort of APR for 8 years, basically, which was actually a recommendation from the CLA survey. So we did make quite a lot of recommendations around new entrants, because I'm very keen to ensure that we do, as everybody says, get new, young, vibrant people into our sector.
Okay, thank you. Can we move on to the next? I think we've covered sort of rent reviews and the like. The next one around joint initiatives with landlords and diversifications, I think, is a really interesting one. And certainly from the findings of our interim, a considerable portion of farmers saw that diversification of income or new initiatives is the main way to fill the BPS gap. Obviously, that presents challenges for tenants. And so this opens up how tenants enter into these agreements and how they might approach landlords. So shall we kick off with landlords' consent to start with, and think about when and how landlords' consent might be needed for diversifications, and then we can move into whether that then might require investments and the like. So does somebody want to kick off on consent?
I'm happy to
Ellie?
put a 2-penny thing, if that's okay. I mean, my biggest
Yeah,
message.
please go for it, Ellie. Thank you.
Sorry, yes. It's just my biggest message to anybody is to say, please, even if your landlord is aware that you are diversifying, whatever that diversification is, do have that consent written down in writing, because from a sheer practicality, we so often come across people who have been subletting a building, having people take short-term lettings on their land, subletting cottages, even going beyond that and going into greater diversification business, and they haven't got either a written consent or they think it's a permanent consent, and then over a rent review or other negotiations, suddenly this becomes a great bone of contention, and that consent isn't there, or the consent you thought was there is not there, or you haven't recorded who is going to put what investment in there. So even if the consent that you're seeking and you agree isn't ideal, at least having something written down makes you know what you have agreed to. There is obviously pressure on landlords to allow further diversifications anyway. I would say practically as well, from a tenant's perspective, if you have a diversification idea and you're asked your landlord for consent, the landlord says no, you record that fact, because if you are then having another rent review and there's pressure on you to agree at an increased rent, those refusals of consent, shall we say, can be as valuable as a consent. You can say, well, I could have given you more rent, but you prevented me doing this.
My point of view, just on that, and it's about maintaining or building or growing income, isn't it? And I think in a tenanted context, clearly need landlord consent before tenants are going to invest vast sums of money, if indeed it is tenants' money, on the holding in permanent structures, be it buildings, be it barn conversions, whether it's to commercial or shops or short-term holiday lets or whatever it might be, or other activities on the farm. And I think there is great scope for joint collaboration. I remember sort of 30 years ago, almost, with the church commissioners on the estate they had down the south coast, of having joint approaches to building conversions where landlord put capital into buildings, and there was a different rental share on the income that was generated from those diversification projects. And I think there is much more scope for that, and of course, the landlord has got the asset to secure debt on, if that's how it's to be funded, which the tenant hasn't. So yeah, I think there's great scope for collaboration in how we get more revenue and more rural business development built on tenanted holdings by landlord and tenant cooperating to do so. And it may be, of course, the tenant isn't the right operator for some of those diversification projects, and that would also encourage maybe bringing a third-party operator with landlord's consent.
So I suppose one of the questions with landlord's consent that is, how do you then agree the deal, if you like, with landlord over any new diversification, new income, who puts in what, who takes out what? And I think that's one that I hear is often one that might inhibit new initiatives, new diversifications going forward. I don't know whether Joe or Jamie or even Charles has got anything to say about how to maybe approach and handle that. Is it be bold, or is it just think carefully before you make any approaches?
I think traditionally it's always been do it via a tenants improvement avenue, which then leads to negotiations about the write-off period and et cetera, and how it's treated in the rent calculation. But I think actually what Charles said was interesting, and I was reading something about it, is actually detaching that right away from the holding and the rent negotiation, and working out a completely separate formula or return on capital, whatever it may be, that the tenant pays to the landlord for that investment in a diversification opportunity, and the fact that he's allowing the tenant to run it or bring in a third party or whatever it may be. So we shouldn't be scared to detach assets away from the existing tenancy agreement to enable the tenant to do something that he wants to do, and equally the landlord to share in it, and not get it all wound up in the complication of the history of the terms, basically.
Absolutely right, Jamie. Sorry, Kate. It's Joe.
It was me, sorry. I was just going to say, I think you need to consider what it is to a degree. If you're using the landlord's property, if you're putting in a building and you're going to invest in it, or you want the landlord to invest in it, they're going to be looking for a return on their capital, in looking at interest rates wherever they sit. So that's your sort of your marker, your guideline as to where you might start. And you also need to think about if, for instance, you can put in a campsite. Actually, a campsite, bed and breakfast, all those types of things are much more labour intensive. You might have some infrastructure in the first instance, but they're not they're using the latent value of the holding, but they're not necessarily the annual reward, in a sense, is very much relating to the effort you put in yourself as tenants. So the percentage of return might vary depending on actually the type of enterprise that you're actually going to be diversifying into. So it is all by negotiation, but you need to know the parameters of what you're doing.
We've done a lot of those sort of things, you say, with campsites, bed and breakfast conversions, etc. And as you say, prior charges on the return for the tenant's input or the operator's input, whatever that might be, before services are split. But just, I want to say one thing: of all of the great diversification that's been created in freehold owners and occupiers, land and wider holdings, and you must have seen this, Kate, in your review, I suppose, comparatively less on tenanted holdings because of this restriction and because of this problem between the parties. And there's so much opportunity, especially in areas where we need it, but the P&Ls are a bit difficult, perhaps, if we're just talking about sheep and beef, possibly in your part of the world, Joe. We need to somehow create much more scope for cooperation between landlord and tenant for a common benefit, really.
I think you sort of almost need to look at it from the perspective of you're actually looking at the type of tenancy you've got, whether it's an agricultural holdings act tenancy or whether you go into a farm business tenancy, which gives you much more flexibility about using diversified enterprises within your agreement, whereas an AHA agreement wouldn't be quite so flexible, and you'd need to look at the structure of your arrangement with that. And certainly I've had some clients that have put in a bakery and things like that, but we've had to move it over to a sort of landlord tenant agreement, so there needs to be a bit more flexibility there as well to consider.
Yes, I think I'm sorry, back in the room, sorry about my power cut there. Just picking up what you've said, Joe. Yes, from an AHA tenant's point of view, I've had the landlord say, well, that diversification is clearly commercial. We need to take it out of the 1986 Act tenancy, re-grant it back to you on a 1954 Act tenancy. And then I asked the question, for what happens on succession? Because you succeed to your 1986 Act tenancy, you do not succeed to a 54 Act tenancy, especially if the landlords want to put exclusion clauses in there. It's getting a bit technical, but the overall principle is you need to pick the wider picture and say, why are we trying to achieve this? And I'm sure those landlords certainly not trying to deprive the tenant of succession, but it is a harsh reality that once you're out of the 86 Act, you're not going back into it. So you need to be just wary on that.
And just following on from Ellie's comment, the succession element of where you are and having permission, if you've got an AHA tenancy, you do need to have your landlord's permission for your succession, for your diversified enterprise, for anything to be considered in your succession calculations. So that's something to be very wary of in whatever you do as a diversified enterprise.
Could I just very, very quickly add, again, everybody is very alive to this, because one of the things that Defra is saying is that diversification will help farmers when the BPS is declining. Well, let's be very, very clear. They hadn't factored in that a lot of tenants can't diversify, or their landlords, and we saw a lot of this. So I'm thrilled to hear of good examples, but I have to be honest with you, I saw a lot of very bad examples as I went across the country of landlords refusing to let their tenants diversify, or would only do so on the condition that there was a change of tenancy agreement, particularly around AHAs. So again, this is a live issue that I think Defra are now very aware of, understanding that diversification is not possible for many tenant farmers.
But that would largely also relate to the landlord's consideration of tax positions, really, with it. So it sort of needs to be rural enterprise protected to encourage that diversification. Indeed, indeed.
And I think, Kate, your point picks up a question we have in, which is around the participant asked the question was around having a company tenancy and landlord being obstructive, not allowing for diversification. And the question is asking, will the ROC review be addressing this? And I think you've answered that question, or certainly your recommendations address it anyway. Yeah, good. Okay. That probably moves us nicely on to the next section, which is on sort of facilitating meetings with landlords and agents. And I know Ellie was keen to talk to us a few points about this. Yeah, this element of blockage, and I think in there again, it was flagged up in the ROC review. Certainly, agents weren't always seen to be as enabling as they might be, and I thought we ought to probably put the case a little bit for enabling agents in some way or form. So, Ellie, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you. I suppose I ought to just say, those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. But then again, I'm going to start throwing some stones. We've all had those bad examples, and sorry for the stone pun, Baroness Rock. But you certainly, you've also identified within your report some of these issues, and I think there is a term used as land agents. We, Jamie, Joe and I sit here as land agents, so in that category, but I hopefully not within the people that you've ever come across. We've all had that problem where you cannot get through to the landlord. It could be large institutional landlord and the agent seems to be blocking. It could be private landlords. Sometimes it is the agent who's trying, and it's the landlord themselves who's just been so very, very difficult. And I have to say, I have more respect for the agents who say, I hear what you say, but my client requires this, rather than the agent trying to tell you black is white simply because their client doesn't want to agree it. I think with everybody, ultimately, if you really do feel that the other side agent or is not acting appropriately, most of us are members of professional organisations, and we have standards and we have responsibilities. And if you talk to another fellow agent, we soon point out what we should and shouldn't be doing. But just because your landlord's agent isn't doing what you want them to do doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. They're acting for the landlord, and your own agent should hopefully be acting for you, which then raises the point is your agent acting properly for you? It's a two-way thing to have a meeting or facilitate a discussion. A lot of times people say to me, I'm frustrated that I haven't heard back from the landlord. The classic is the rent review. We used to start rent reviews off 6 months before the rent review date, then it became 4 months, 2 months, and things such as, for example, foot and mouth. That itself, I remember one arbitrator telling me he had a cannabis rent review 2nd of February, and he'd been appointed as arbitrator, and then foot and mouth happened, and it was on a livestock farm. And he said, well, you could understand why the tenant and landlord were completely at sea, because something had happened so close to the rent review date, albeit in that case afterwards. You can understand why people want to leave rent reviews as late as possible to the rent review date before they have discussions, so you're using the most up-to-date information. But how many times do tenants find that the first they know about it is when they receive a notification that there's been an application for appointment of an arbitrator? I mean, that is really bad. There's no proposals made, no attempt to negotiate. And that doesn't help on costs and understanding what the landlord's looking for. I would say to anybody who feels that they're getting nowhere with trying to facilitate a meeting, is the very first thing to do is keep a record of every time you ask for a meeting and what response you got. Professionally, if there is an agent instructed, we're not supposed to go behind the agent to their client. That is a protocol. You respond with the client, with the agent, but the agent definitely isn't responding, and you've evidence that you've asked the agent for response and they've just ignored you. The landlord is still there. There'll be some recourse, some course route to get through to them, and your own agent should be able to help you do that. I appreciate that for some tenants may say, well, that means I'm using my own agent and running up costs. But if it actually opens the door, that's what we're there to try and help. If you do have meetings or any interactions with the landlords, I would also like to just advise that you keep your own record of that meeting. And even if you've had a very amicable meeting, there's no reason why that meeting itself shouldn't be recorded in writing. If you can email afterwards, put down, make it quite clear what your understanding of that meeting is. And even to the extent of if you record that meeting and the other side doesn't dispute it, if you're not going to get back any written confirmation, at least they haven't disputed what you've put in writing. And I said earlier on about diversification, so many times, people have misunderstandings of what has been agreed or not been agreed. And I'm reiterating a little bit I said before, if you're asking for something from your landlord and you feel they're saying no, sometimes it can be useful to ask why. It could be because they have plans for the farm or their own financial situation such that they can't contribute towards an investment or whatever it is. They could give you good reason. But ultimately, do keep a record of everything, not least of all because not only do we see that landlords change, but definitely their landlords agents change. And all too often when we're dealing with this, the agents haven't even got the file from the previous agent. The landlord hasn't. And you know, some of my clients, I've outlived about 6 landlords agents, but we've got the piece of paper on that file going back to beginning of the tenancy and beginning of father's tenancy, and we can follow it through. So do keep those notes there. And finally, you know, just to reiterate, if you're having a meeting with a landlord, it is a two-way thing. They may not be coming to you, but what are you doing to try and instigate that meeting with them? So make sure your own agent is actually doing it, not just fobbing you off with, I haven't heard from the landlord. Perhaps asking what they are doing as well for that one. Sorry, that's my little bit of a soapbox about making sure the wheels moving.
Thank you, Ellen. I think there's some very good points and tips in there for takeaways for all of us, I think. Does anybody else want to add anything to facilitating or unblocking blockages or facilitating meetings? Any experience? No. Can I just,
Greg, can I just say one of the
sure.
One of the review recommendations was that we've suggested there should be a tenant farming ombudsman or commissioner who people could go to resolve issues. Again, we heard as many good examples of landlord-tenant relationship, we heard an equal number of very, very difficult relationships. And one of our recommendations is clearly that you guys, the land agents, have a very, very important role to facilitate between a landlord and a tenant. And that is again something that the Secretary of State and the Farming Minister are very clear to ensure that that land agents are seen as a sort of convener and an understanding that a collaborative relationship is incredibly important. So I think most of the land agents that I've been speaking to across the country have recognised this point.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Yeah. Just a couple more questions before we're getting towards the end now. There's one actually that's come in, which relates to diversifications, and it asks the question, are there any issues with diversifications off the holding? Would anybody like to step in and
the tenant conducting a business off the holding?
That's yes, yeah.
Keeping based on the holding.
Yeah. Does that count towards, I'm assuming, be seen as tenants' income or have any factor on any of their on holding?
I have in rent reviews, I have had the landlord raise the fact that the tenant has their own job. I think one case it was the tenant worked as a farm business consultant, and the farm office, farmhouse was used to support this other business, be it contracted business, etc. So it does start to become an issue. There's no hard and fast rule of how it's treated, but it can become an issue. You then remind the landlord, well, on an AHA, it's not the actual tenant we consider in a rent review, it is a hypothetical tenant. And if the actual tenant is doing something different to what a hypothetical tenant would do, then you keep yourself to what the hypothetical tenant would do.
Does this particular example perhaps just expand on succession cases? So if significant proportion of the income of the business, the tenant's business income is being earned off the holding, maybe the son, is that something we can have 5 minutes on from the expertise we've got on the panel? Yeah,
it is. The test for livelihood under a succession is from your agricultural work on the holding or the wider unit. The problem happens where you're doing agricultural work or other work not on the unit. So for example, the easy example is a contractor. You're doing agricultural work, you may be ploughing, drilling, spraying, but not on the unit for your neighbours. And that starts to become ineligible income for that one. Diversification, as I think Joe mentioned earlier on, that if you've got landlord's consent for diversification on the holding or the unit, that can be treated as eligible income. But if you're running an alternative business off the unit, it's the ineligible side of it. So there are complications there, and that's why understanding the succession rules as they currently are, as they're going to change, is very vital. And that, you know, question on how soon do you start succession planning, you start today, because if you understand the rules, then you may structure your business and your income differently. You may even decide succession isn't going to work because I need to earn my money in a different way, but at least you have that understanding and awareness, so that if, God forbid, the tenant goes under proverbial red tractor, people haven't assumed things could happen only to find out too late that because they've been earning an income, they're no longer eligible that way.
I mean, that's a crucial part of this FFR delivery. I think this whole succession case for family farms, where next generation's coming through, that whole ability for this to perhaps unlock a bit of succession planning, free of charge, obviously, I think is absolutely crucial. As you say, it's a long-term business. It's not something that happens tomorrow, is it?
Yeah. It is, and I think it's to my mind, that family, you know, one could be very stereotypical about what is that tenant's family, but there is usually a spouse, there is usually children, it's usually aspirations, and it is not just about the tenant having an understanding, it's a whole family have got to have an understanding. You know, the classic case of a married or tenant farmer living with spouse in the farm or partner in the farmhouse. Suddenly the tenant has an accident, and the whole farming business, the farmhouse, family house, etc., can be at risk. And so people need to understand what the issues are and whether they are likely to succeed or otherwise, to protect themselves. It's like an insurance policy in the worst case scenario, to understand where they stand.
Okay, so obviously a lot to discuss here and a lot of depth to go into. We've got a number of questions that we're not going to be able to get to today. What we will do is we will share any questions asked, and I think let's share some of the questions that we had in the background, if you like, that I think will inform particularly the last 2 or 3 of those boxes that we see online now. What we're trying to do is to demonstrate that there's a lot of expertise here, and this is a subject that we believe we can really, or the range of subjects around tenancy matters are ones that we really think we can help support as part of this project. So if we have any more questions coming on the Q&A, we'll pick those up. I think Kate has answered one directly. Thank you, Kate, for that. So would anybody like to make any closing comments? Charles?
Just one for me to start with, if that's okay. I think all I would say really in terms of farm incomes and farming is going through a huge change, not just because of policy change post-Brexit and lots of CAP and BPS and everything else, but now the cases you alluded to earlier, you know, huge change in production economics, absolutely vast. And I think one of the crucial things for farming families and farmers to get a handle on is what all of those volatile cost ingredient shifts mean for their business and what that means for next year, other than what happened last year, because it's kind of irrelevant. Things have changed so much. We're seeing now through many different sectors, from beef and sheep and pigs and egg production, salads, root crops, etc., with high cost structures that have changed, which is not supporting the market at the moment. And I think getting a handle on that, how it affects businesses and how it affects the future strategy for that business, including the landlord, really, because whilst there might be landlords, you know, nothing to like us to get hold of vacant possession. I'm sure there are lots of landlords. We know there are lots of landlords who want custodians of the countryside, want custodians of their asset for the long term, and collaboration, discussion around what these changes mean for that holding and what other things need to be brought into consideration. I mean, the time is absolutely urgent for that, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else? Okay. So if we just go on to the last slide, and I'm conscious we have 3 minutes to finish before TFA webinar starts, and on a different channel, obviously. So thank you, everybody, for listening. So the process on the previous slide is, for those who are interested in working with us, please do give us a call, send us an email. We'll be very happy to discuss things further with interested parties, particularly tenants. We don't have a prescriptive tenancy intervention. So it's very much down to work out what are the particular areas that tenants want to concentrate on. So there's no blueprint. We're very happy to dedicate the day of support to whatever area a tenant wants to talk about. It might be any of the previous interventions. It could be specifically on these tenancy matters. So please do get in contact with us. Thank you everybody for attending tonight. A big thanks to the panel. Baroness Rock, really appreciate your time. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Charles. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks' time on land and property, where we're particularly looking at planning, and we will also have some thoughts and some expertise on nutrient neutrality that I know is challenging some areas of the country as well. So thank you all for listening. Do appreciate it. Have a good evening. Thank you again.